did not take long for him to be embraced by the heretofore rebellious troops. But at this point in the history of the Empire, being embraced by the troops was a dangerous proposition. So when the British legions got together and decided to hail Pertinax their new emperor, Pertinax outright refused. Deeply unsettled by the position he found himself in, he wrote to Commodus requesting immediate reassignment. Now, you would think the fact that the British legions kept trying to declare new emperors would have led to some sort of imperial action. But apparently, Commodus, and at this point Cleander, vastly underestimated the severity of the situation. Soon enough, though, they would no longer be able to ignore it. In 186, a charismatic army deserter in Gaul named Maternus began to round up a motley crew of followers consisting of fellow deserters, ex-soldiers, and brigands. At first, they were concerned mostly with raiding the countryside for their own enrichment, but eventually, after more and more men flocked to his banner, Maternus began to think of himself as the second coming of Spartacus. His force grew to the point that raids on towns turned into sieges of small cities. He led his men back and forth across the Pyrenees, causing havoc in the under-garrisoned portions of Spain and Gaul, before finally the powers that be realized that there was a renegade army running loose within the empire. The response to this brief uprising, sometimes called the Deserters' War, was spearheaded by Pescennius Niger, who was finally able to confront Maternus' force and defeat it in open battle. But, undeterred, in March of 187, Maternus regrouped with a corps of supporters and headed south into Italy. The plan now was to infiltrate Rome during an upcoming festival, get close to the emperor, and assassinate him. The plot was not as outlandish as it sounds. The festival involves citizens of every class putting on costumes and partying in the streets. Maternus managed to secure some Praetorian Guard uniforms, and figured that with everyone, including the guard, getting good and drunk in an atmosphere of shifting identities, that he might just be able to bluff his way into the imperial entourage. But before the conspiracy got off the ground, Maternus was betrayed by one of his followers over some personal slight, and the assassins were all rounded up and executed. The already paranoid Commodus was driven further round the bend by the revelation that his life had been saved not by the fact that his bodyguards were so super great at their jobs, but because the conspiracy had been betrayed by a disgruntled ex-member. Further compounding his agitation was a note passed along by Pertinax that one of Commodus's brothers-in-law and a few other senators were gathering support for their own assassination attempt. It seems that Pertinax thought the chances of the conspirators dim, and so decided to make double sure that he wasn't implicated in the plot, and alerted the emperor after he himself was invited to join. From this point on, Commodus was rendered practically inert. He never left the safe confines of the palace, or, if he wasn't in Rome, the safety of his country villas. The only public appearances he made for the rest of his reign were when he performed as a gladiator, seemingly the only time that he actually felt safe and comfortable. But though Commodus was a publicly invisible emperor, he was still a force to be reckoned with in private, and not in a good way at all. With Perennis as his colleague, Commodus had taken a shine to debasing the Senate, making erratic bureaucratic appointments, and doing whatever he could to personally humiliate individual members of the aristocracy. But now, with Cleander as his partner in crime, everything was ratcheted up a couple of notches. Cleander made a fortune selling offices, membership in the Senate, and plum overseas appointments, while Commodus encouraged his freedmen to harass senators, confiscate their property, and, when the mood struck him, murder them. Further compounding the mockery they were making of the government was the fact that the two men actually spent very little time thinking about the government, and chose instead to focus on exploring the vast and wide depths of sexual depravity. I won't go into the details because, hey, this is a family podcast, but suffice it to say that there was some pretty brutal stuff going on at the palace, and not at all behind closed doors. In mid-187, Cleander took the lead in a new round of purges, this one aimed at anyone connected to the conspiracy Pertinax had decided to expose. Luckily for Cleander, the families involved were also personal enemies, who represented the last real organized threat to his power. So, this latest round of political murders is further notable for sweeping up the Empress Crispina along with everyone else. It doesn't look like she was in any way involved in the plot, but rather that she simply fell victim to the whims of a probably sociopathic emperor who had grown tired of his wife. Bad enough that she was exiled and then killed, but her crime, the one so heinous that she was exiled and killed for it, was simply being caught up engaging in an extramarital affair. You know, the kind her husband had engaged in every single day of their marriage. Stay classy, Commodus. In 188, Cleander further solidified his grip on power by creating a new office that superseded the two Praetorian prefects, effectively putting him in charge of the Emperor's secret police. Up to this point, Cleander had controlled the guard much as Perennis had, by constantly hiring and firing the prefects so none of them could create enduring loyalty within the ranks. But having finally set the record by allowing one poor appointee to remain in office a mere 6 hours, Cleander finally decided that this was maybe getting a little ridiculous, that there needed to be some kind of institutional stability. What if the guard actually needed to do something? So he invented a new office, assumed it, and then ran the Praetorians himself. At this point, it seemed like things would go on like this forever. Cleander had a stranglehold on Rome, the enemies of the new imperial order were all dead or exiled, and Commodus cared only about chariot racing, sitting in the baths, and gladiatorial combat. The empire was slowly being driven into the ground, but anyone in a position to actually do anything about it were the ones already behind the wheel and doing said driving. But as so often happens in these sorts of bloodily tyrannical quasi-police states, one minute you're up, and the next minute you're being airbrushed out of that photo of you and Stalin enjoying a nice glass of vodka together. For Cleander, the end came in 190, a year in which he and Commodus conspired to appoint 25 different men consul, a record that would stand unchallenged for the rest of the life of the empire. Remember when consulships were a sacred office that marked the prestigious climax of a long and distinguished career? Yeah, no one else does either. Included in that infamously long roll call of consuls for 190, though, was a man who was about to reach the new climax point for the Roman politician, Septimius Severus. In one of those classic "it's the economy, stupid" moments, Cleander's fall from power was precipitated by a grain shortage in Rome. Without a major crisis getting in his way, Cleander was able to more or less come and go as he pleased. But as soon as the grain stopped flowing, and someone needed to be scapegoated, well, that someone was naturally the man who had just spent 5 years lording over everyone how much power he had. The few active enemies of the imperial chamberlain left alive seized the opportunity the food shortages presented and organized a very public display against the emperor's favorite at the one place the emperor was bound to hear about it, in the Circus Maximus. In April of 190 AD, at a set of chariot races, a group of children were given anti-Cleander banners and were snuck down onto the field where they began shouting anti-Cleander chants. The hope was that if children were used, that the Praetorians wouldn't be able to just march out and club them all to death, and the trick seems to have worked. The crowd eventually joined in the chanting, and before too long they had worked themselves into a frenzy and marched out of the Circus Maximus towards the villa Cleander was staying at. Facing down a crowd of nearly 150,000, Cleander ordered the Praetorian Guard to move in and beat the mob into submission. But when he called for backup from the urban cohorts, who were at this point led by newly appointed urban prefect Pertinax not only ignored the call, but he ordered his own troops into the crowd to help them drive off the Praetorians. Cleander fled to the imperial villa Commodus was relaxing at, but as with Perennis, the emperor was more than willing to throw his favorite under the bus if that seemed like the safest course of action for Commodus. So rather than face the wrath of the mob himself, Cleander was handed over to the crowd, who promptly killed him and dragged his body through the streets. The fall of Cleander was accompanied by yet another round of purges, and anyone with a close connection to the dead Chamberlain found themselves added to the emperor's prescription list, rather than being asked to help draw them up. These are the times when you start to understand the appeal of a philosophy like Epicureanism, with its emphasis on leaving politics to those cruel enough and dumb enough to get caught up in it. During the reign of Commodus, you were either up and orchestrating the murder of your enemies, or you were down and being murdered by your enemies. Those leaders who survived to see the other side were either like Pertinax and willing to follow the winds wherever they blew, personal honor be damned, or like Septimius Severus, who kept his head down, but in witnessing the petty, bloody back and forth in Rome, developed an entirely cynical philosophy of government that would help transform the empire into the unstable, banana republic-style military dictatorships of the 3rd century. But before we get to the founding of the new Severan dynasty, we still have to cover the last ignoble phase of the Nervan Antonine dynasty. The unbroken line of high-quality emperors that stretch back nearly a century and produce some of the most recognizable names in Roman imperial history, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, was about to be broken. Just as Nero had wrecked the Julio-Claudians and Domitian had wrecked the Flavians, Commodus was about to wreck the Antonines. In defense of the first two, the legitimacy of the Julio-Claudians was already a shaky proposition by the time Nero arrived, and Domitian was toppled not for being a terrible emperor, but for being an unusually arrogant one. Commodus, on the other hand, took an entirely healthy dynasty, spun a hard right, and just drove it into a brick wall. He was arrogant like establishing an effective autocracy. He oversaw sloppy, corrupt, and decadent administration that bankrupted the empire, left its infrastructure to rot, and purged out most of its talented leaders. Commodus saved the best for last, though, and during his last 2 years in office, he really kicked the crazy up a notch. Basically, if Commodus had had his way, this podcast would not be called The History of Rome, it would be called The History of Commodiana. And I wouldn't be talking about how the Romans kicked off this or that campaign season in the month of April, but instead talking about how the Commodians kicked off this or that new campaign season in the month of Commodus. And also, did you know that Commodus was the reincarnation of Hercules? Not just that he liked to associate himself with Hercules, mind you, but that he was literally the reincarnation of Hercules? Yes, good times were ahead. The crazy really got rolling right after Cleander and his allies were liquidated. Rather than elevate some new favorite to power, the now 29-year-old Commodus decided that it was time to rule in his own right. He still surrounded himself with corrupt sycophants, most notably his mistress Marcia, new chamberlain Eclectus, and new praetorian prefect Quintus Letus. But unlike in his past dealings with Satyrus, Perennis, and Cleander, Commodus did not delegate his imperial responsibilities. But then again, neither did he really embrace them either. Instead, the governance of the empire was just sort of set adrift. Commodus spent nearly every day fighting as a gladiator, or enjoying the races, and his only real concern was making sure that he had enough money to pay for it all.